Our bodies are wise. Our bodies are constantly communicating something. Rebecca Reeder from Recovery Café joins us to talk about eating disorders and substance abuse. She talks about finding her own path through recovery and invites others to do the same. Enjoy. Welcome to the Illuminate Recovery podcast. We shed light on mental health issues, mental illness, and addiction recovery. Ways to cope, manage, and inspire. Beyond the self-care we will discuss, you may need the help of a licensed professional. My name's Kurt Nider. I'm a husband, a father, entrepreneur, a handyman, and a student of life. I avoid conflict, I deflect with humor, and I'm fascinated by the human experience.
And I'm Shelley Mangum. I am a clinical mental health counselor, and my favorite role of all times is grandma. I am a seeker of truth, and I feel like life should be approached with tremendous curiosity.
I ask the dumb questions.
I fill in the gaps.
The Illuminate Recovery podcast is brought to you by Illuminate Billing Advocates. Make billing and collection simple with leader in substance abuse and mental health billing services. Verification and analysis of benefits, pre-authorizations, utilization management, accurate claim submission and management, denial and appeal management, and industry-leading reporting. Improve your practice's cash flow and your ability to help your clients with Illuminate Billing Advocates.
So today, Kurt and I are super excited to talk to Rebecca Reeder. Rebecca has her own story and works in the recovery industry. She is in communications and development specialist in the Recovery Café network. She is all about growth, joy, and solution seeking. She's after my heart, right? I love that stuff. She's deeply dedicated to fostering collaboration, increasing awareness about mental and behavioral health, and discovering creative, valuable ways to serve the community. Rebecca, thanks for being willing to be on with us today.
Yeah, so excited. Thanks for having me.
I know that we've chatted a little bit here, but might be a good idea to let our audience kind of have an idea of your background, where you come from, and what got you into this particular industry. Because, and I've said this before, but I don't know of too many people that grow up and go, yeah, I really want to work in substance abuse, or I really want to work with eating disorders, right? Life has a way of kind of directing our path. So maybe talk about how you ended up here.
Sure. So, as a person in my own recovery, we're trained in how to tell this story. And when I celebrated 15 years last December, it was during a time globally where we were having kind of this social reckoning around equity and inclusion and white supremacy and racism. And it really made me rethink the way that I conceptualize my own story. And I'm still, wrestling with all that and have a lot to learn and figure out still. But, I used to tell this story like the way 12-step teaches us to tell a story, which is, this is what it was like, this is what happened, and what it's like now. And none of the facts really have changed about who I am or what I've experienced, but the lens that I'm looking at all that through is now so different. And I'm cognizant of how much privilege I've had along the way, really from the beginning, in always having access to help. And so I may not have wanted that help. I may have been really sick and not been able to see, what was what, but I've had access in a very, very privileged way to all the things that have enabled me to recover. So I want to say that first. And then the longer I'm on this recovery journey and this growth journey, the further back I can name things that were just so difficult and unhealthy. So, both of my parents struggle with mental health still. They don't choose to engage in any kind of recovery for themselves. And so they're still living with active, mental illness. My dad has an eating disorder as well, which is a form of mental illness, but that really colored my whole growing up years. And so I, developed some pretty disordered eating real young, 7 or 8, and found substances around age 13. And that went on until I started my first attempt at recovery at age 19. And, there's like all these markers around, like in my mind around what was hard and what, and really it all just kind of blends together. And I don't think my story is that unusual, even punctuated with all these different separate experiences of sexual assault and violence and things like that. It's just so common. My story is just so common. And that's what breaks my heart, is that most of us are walking around trying to figure out how to live life in this joyful, free way that feels like it's worth living, just under this really, really heavy cloud of reality.
Well, and what you share is super powerful. It took me back to when I was in college getting my degree in mental health counseling, and I read, I don't know what course I was in, but what I read was that as a white American I was entitled. And I'm like, what are you talking about? How can I be entitled? What is the message you're trying to give me here? And as I read that, that information, I'm like, oh, I didn't choose to be entitled, but just the fact that I am a white American, it gives me privileges and opportunities that I just take for granted are mine. And so when you talk about that, it's an interesting shift to go, oh, like you were able to even get into treatment. So many people, I think it's 10%, if I threw out a random number, 10% of people actually reach out to get treatment. And so that does begin to make that a pretty huge privilege. And we can say entitled, but it's not it's not that we chose that. It just happens to be our situation, which then also requires some responsibility on our part. And I think that's the message. I think that's why your story is not so different than a lot of people, but it's what you've done with your story that really is where the power lies, I think.
Thank you. And I agree. I agree that there is a level of responsibility that people with immense privilege should kind of rise up to, especially given, things are not more equal, things are not more equitable. Mental health and substance use rates continue to rise, despite everything that's, just in this country alone, everything that's opened. You guys do billing. You see how many programs are operating and how many people are having these conversations about like who deserves care. And so, even walking into my first 12-step meeting, I was this, white, hetero-looking, cisgendered female who was, an appropriate age. My body was the appropriate size. I was dressed in an appropriate way. There was all these things that I never understood how much that was greasing the wheels for me to participate and then later choose to not, to leave the 12-step community, having learned so much and being so grateful for all the things that it taught me, but it just not being my place anymore. And even just having the ability to do that, and make that choice and have other places I could go and say, hey, I want, I'm ready for this kind of healing. I'm ready for this kind of work. I'm ready to just all the things. It's just really hard to even think about my own recovery story anymore without thinking about those things.
Well, I want to ask you a question. I just heard you say, that 12 steps taught you an awful lot, and it was a part of probably your early recovery. but that's not part of your recovery now. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because some people are like, once an addict, always an addict, and we stay true to our, to our club, and there's a lot of controversy around that. So talk about that a little bit.
There is a lot of controversy. When I was first introduced to 12-step recovery, it was appealing. I mean, it's appealing. It was appealing to me for the same reasons it's probably appealing to a lot of people. Is it provides a lot of structure and predictability and kind of norms, operating norms as a human. And when I was so dysregulated in my eating, untreated eating disorder, untreated substance use, I needed some guardrails. I needed to just like show up somewhere and know exactly how to behave, what to do, what not to do. It's very black and white. And that is, to a person whose brain is like, my brain is totally dysregulated from all my trauma. I'm severely malnourished from my eating disorder. I'm still, processing substances out of my liver and kidney, it was really nice. It was nice to just like show up and know exactly what to do so that I was doing it right. And over the years, AA taught me how to take a hard look at myself. It taught me how to be honest about myself. It taught me how to like tell the truth about myself without drowning in so much shame and embarrassment about who I was, and just kind of own up. I think it helped nurture that part of me that already existed, which was just kind of like, I want to grow and I want to fight to be better, and I want to I just want to push back against everything that's wrong, and it nurtured that part of me on some level. And then, a while in, I spent several years in and out of AA, because I didn't understand, and no one else did either, that my eating disorder was really preventing me from doing any kind of real work. And once I sought help for that, my sobriety stabilized. But after a while, it just became very confining and restricting. And I was no longer thriving or growing. I was performing, and I was trying to fit in, and I was trying to make what was right for everyone else be right for me. And while I still know, I have no interest in using substances, I still want to grow, I still want to work on, my spiritual life and all of that. 12-step community just no longer felt like a safe, supportive place. It just felt really restricting and confining. So I made the choice to leave, which was terrifying, and it wasn't like one day I was going and the next day it wasn't. It was a slow, transition out, and having to figure out what else needed to take that place, which was a ton of therapy. It was trauma work. It was energy work. It was a support system that was really diverse and healthy. It was my family, all that. And so it wasn't like I'm cured and, I'm going to go out into the world, but it was a lot less, it was just a lot less rigid. I needed a more free-flowing way to continue recovering.
Well, and I think your what you're describing is really part of recovery, is to have all of the resources that work for you wrapped around you. And although 12 steps is incredible and it does an amazing work at helping people, it's only one resource. It's not all of them. And some may choose. I love 12 step, right? I love going. It's not something that's been a huge portion of my life, but I've always loved going and thinking about the 12 steps and how I can live them and how those can help my life. But I need so much more than what the 12 steps offers, and I think that's what you're talking about. And I don't think that, some people get sober on 12 steps, but I don't think that's because that's the only, support and resource that they're utilizing, right? I think it takes a whole community sometimes to raise somebody, right? Can you talk about some of the other? I mean, you talked about therapy and trauma work, and doing those things that you did in order to continue your recovery. And something that I don't hear, I mean, I think it happens a lot, is talking about eating disorders and how that plays into the picture. Can you talk about the role? And I'm curious, do you see an eating disorder as synonymous with addiction? How do you see addiction and eating disorders differing, and then what did you have to do to kind of, because I heard you say until you got your eating disorder under control, your addiction really was not manageable. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so my struggle with food and eating and things like that definitely predated any substance use that was a part of my life. And so from a very, very young age, I learned how to, I learned behaviors from my dad, and things were normalized in my house around food that were just really disordered. And so as I, grew up I mean, this whole world, like culture as a whole, is very diet culture-y. It's very shaming. We are given license to police each other's bodies and, have comments about everything. And so you grow up in that, and then you also grow up watching someone, living out their active eating disorder. So of course I ended up struggling myself. But when I came into my first detox facility, I was still very, very sick of my eating disorder. Those behaviors were just a part of everything, as much as drinking and using substances. And so every time I would, go to intensive outpatient or go to detox or something like that, everyone had all these ideas around how to help me with that. But I also didn't really understand how much help I needed with my food. And so I would cycle in and out of AA. I would put some time together, maybe like 6 months, 8 months. But as soon as I stopped using substances, the only other tools that I had were related to food in my body. And so all those behaviors would intensify. And, your brain and your body there's no healing. It's like just still being stuck in that really traumatized space. Your brain is offline, you're shut down, you're showing up and going through the motions, but nothing's really integrating. My brain was severely malnourished. I was constantly in a trauma state. And, there's just not a lot of recovery that can happen when you're in that state. And so later, I cycled in and out of AA like that for 5 or 6 years. And I ended up tearing part of my esophagus from purging. And you might want to mention in the beginning of this, like, some people find these descriptions kind of triggering, but, and it scared me. And so I agreed to go to treatment finally for my eating disorder. And still thinking, I didn't need to go, really having a lot of fears around like seeking treatment at that high a level for something that I had lived with my whole life. And once I had that a little bit, I think just some awareness around that, I was able to then come back to AA and have a different, my eating disorder it wasn't cured, I wasn't better, I was still, but there was a level of awareness around this needs to be part of things that I'm getting more honest about and getting help for. And so slowly I started to incorporate more of that into my recovery. And the more work I do on things as a whole, the deeper and broader my recovery gets. And so I will say eating disorders are a mental health condition. I am not a believer in food addiction, sugar addiction, which is also very controversial for people. Our bodies are very, very wise, and our bodies are very, very, our bodies are constantly communicating something. And so there's the mental health part of eating disorders. And then there's just this other part around, like, I'm hungry. I'm hungry and I'm not nourished, and I haven't been nourished since I was very, very young, maybe ever. And that's okay. You know, my body has changed immensely over the decades that I've been traveling my own recovery road. That's been great, and that's been really hard. And, you know, bodies change, brains change. Everything is meant to change. And so being able to embrace this part of me where it's like really fighting back against the diet culture aspect, good and bad food, clean and dirty food, what's allowed, am I allowed to have this appetite right now? Is it okay to feed myself for a purely emotional reason? Yes, it is. It is. There's nothing wrong with, you know, there's nothing wrong with just riding these waves of figuring out how to be in my body more and more, which is what substance use is all about. It's about not being able to tolerate the distress of living in our brains and our minds and our bodies. And so I don't see the healing process as different, really, other than, you know, initially there's a lot more very specific, you know, medical interventions that have to go along with eating disorder recovery. I'm still on medication, you know. I think that's a part of staying healthy from an eating disorder and mental health standpoint, but also my substance use. You know, I've stayed compliant with my medication for a long, long time, and that's a big part of just how I stay well. So there's a lot of pieces that overlap.
Well, and I'm curious, and I love that you bring up the medication part, because, you know, we need to wrap these resources around us, and it can't be, you know, we can't be fighting against the stigma that if you're on a medication, you're not truly sober. And I know that that's shifted in the industry a lot, but it's still kind of there. Those medications are wonderful resources. I'm curious, and eating disorders is not my specialty, so I'm curious how the medications help with eating disorders. What does that look like? I mean, you can talk about your experience. I don't know if that's generalized.
Yeah, so for me, finding a psychiatrist, and, you know, this was all done in conjunction with a therapist and all of that, and now I just, you know, I know what works, and I'm able to, I've had enough practice, you know, I know. But the medication that I'm given helps with my part of what can be an underlying piece for eating disorders is obsessive compulsive disorder. And so there's an element of, you know, looping thoughts, racing thoughts, compulsivity, things like that. And so the medication helps with those kinds of, that pervasive looping, rumination around certain things. And so it just kind of interrupts my brain from some of those patterns. And for whatever reason, you know, my brain just doesn't make chemicals the way that it was designed to. I came into this world, you know, born into a family who, you know, my parents both come from highly traumatized backgrounds, lots of substance use, lots of poverty, lots of domestic violence, you know, their own sexual abuse stories. You know, I come into this home as, you know, their first child. None of this has been resolved for them. And so what I understand now is, you know, when we think about those first relationships that we form, and what does it mean to have secure attachment in your family of origin, and how attachment and safety and security really prime the brain to wire and develop in ways that make us able to function like normal adults. I don't really know what that means, function like normal adult, but I mean, you know, my brain it had a lot to contend with from a very, very, you know, early age. And so that was the environment I grew up in, like many, many people do. Your brain it's doing the best it can, and it's going to wire in a way that it can make sense of. And so for me, it just wired in some pretty haywire, sideways ways. And, I've done a lot of work to rewire and heal some of those parts of my brain. And some of those parts of my brain are just never, it's just never gonna magically totally rewire, And so I need some help. And that's okay. That is totally okay. That is genetics, that is epigenetics, that is biology, that is physiology. That is not a moral feeling or because I didn't go to enough meetings or I didn't get honest enough in my step work or I'm not doing the right kind of service work. My brain is it's had a rough go. And I'm going to help it out a little bit so that I can have a shot at a good life.
I love that. I love that mentality too, is that you take those outside opinions and perceptions and you own what's yours, right? And I also love the way you talk about listening to your body. Your body is sending you messages constantly. And when you start to listen to those messages, you can interrupt patterns and provide what your body's asking for, and you can specialize your approach to what you need and not what everybody else might think you need, which is that's tough because we like to please people. We're wired for connection. I also love the way you talk about the neural pathways. I mean, I'm imagining, and I do this often when I'm talking with a client or anybody, is what must that have been like for somebody to grow up in an environment where what wired for you in your neural pathways was what you were in, right? You were wiring together how to cope with what was shown you in your environment. And so of course those are pretty tightly wired connections. Did you come with them naturally, or were you born with them, or did you develop them? Yeah, both. And who really knows how to decipher that, because now they're there and now you got to address what's there and what is real for you. And I love the way you've kind of come to that, because I think it's really powerful. And it lends to the idea that that you get to choose what to do with what you've been given. And I think, I don't know, that's pretty powerful for me. And I think about the ability to choose, and choose our stories and choose our outcome and choose what happens to us. And I think the ability to choose grows as we wrap ourselves around these resources and we do our work. Talk to me about some of the things and some of the things the feelings that you have around what I just said, and how you're applying that in your life. In other words, some of the choices that you have made, and you've talked about that a little bit. Now you're in the, I'm going to rephrase my question because it was way too big. Now you're in the recovery industry, and you've got this wealth of experience and this wealth of knowledge. How are you sharing that with others? What are you doing with that?
Gosh, my plan was not to go into this work professionally. That was never like, I had been sober probably, I had been in recovery, I don't know, 8 or 9 years before someone suggested that I should explore this as an option, and I thought it was a very silly suggestion, but I was also kind of at a loss for like, what else am I going to do? And so I decided, you know what, I'll try it. Let's try walking down this road, see how it feels, see, if it doesn't feel right, then I'll turn around and do something else. And so my first, aside from like participating in mutual aid groups, was working at a residential treatment center here in Arizona. And I was lucky enough to, be given a chance to kind of start my career there. And I got the lowest level of licensure in Arizona that allows you to work in a facility, and I spent years there just growing, blooming, blossoming. It was an amazing, amazing experience, and I learned so much about myself, so much about, what does it look like when we're bringing in all of our unresolved stuff to relationships with others where we're trying to impart some kind of healing. You can't, like you just show up as yourself no matter where you go or what you're doing, whether you're a staff member or, a resident. Your stuff is your stuff. And so I wanted to be really good at my job. And so I had to start working on my stuff, in a whole new way. And so I did. I ended up back in therapy and, blah, blah, blah. So there's a professional part of getting this message out or being, a change agent or being, however people describe themselves, like being an advocate, being, I just genuinely love watching the lights come on for people. I genuinely love, being able to provide some sort of safe connection or space for people to explore parts of themselves, to see what they want to do. You want to continue to be a person using substances. Okay. Like that's okay. You want to be a person who, is still active in your eating disorder or still, you don't have to get better. And it's not for me to decide, that is the benchmark, that everyone who struggles should enter recovery. And it took me a long time to really believe that, because I thought, why wouldn't you? If life was this hard and I know how much pain that is, or I knew how much pain it was for me, like, why wouldn't you want something different? And it's not for me to decide. And so that's part of it, is like doing enough of my own work that I can take myself out of the equation, and remain really neutral, but safe and loving and like, attuned to what people are saying and not saying. I've done some other creative projects that are, were just like fun community stuff, and I'd love to do that again. But I've also just like, I love working and I love learning. And so I've put myself in positions where I can use these natural skills or my personality to make parts of the process that are usually really hard for people a little bit easier. Which for most of my career has been more of an admissions role in different facilities and, being that person that helps make that process a little bit simpler, however I can. If you want to come, let's make that happen. If you're not ready to come, okay. Whatever. And I love that. I get to hear people's stories, and I get to, take all the crappy stuff that makes coming into treatment really hard, to kind of take that off their plate. And so.
Well, and that idea that you can accept people exactly where they're at, I mean, that's not an easy thing to do, because if somebody comes in and says, I'm still going to use, I still want that to be part of my life, or, I'm still going to restrict food intake because that's so important to me. Like our whole bodies scream and say, no, you can't do that because that's dangerous and we have to save you, right? But there's a lot of work that goes into being able to sit in that space and go, okay, if that's what you want to do, let's help you be successful at that and not die, or be successful at that and, have the greatest joy in life, right? The greatest rewards in life that you can while you choose to do that, right? That's not an easy place to sit.
It's not an easy place to sit, and I think it's even harder when I was working, like those first few years I spent at a residential facility. I mean, I would get so bent out of shape and just consumed with, patients on my caseload that end up back at the facility, or I know that they're going to leave here and not be okay, or, they're making all these, what I was determining to be really, unsafe choices, really poor choices. And, I was just so full of myself. And it just seeped out of every pore, that I have some, and that's what we're trained. I mean, as therapists, like, you get in some way, like, you're trained to be that way. You're supposed to have the answer. You're supposed to, guide your little chickens into the safety coop and, all of that. But, like, there is so little dignity in that. And I would much rather spend my time learning how to be just more loving and open so that people feel like they can be who they want to be. And a lot of people end up in treatment that don't want to be there. And so we think that resistance is a lot of things. We label it even resistance. What would it be like if there were just truly, truly safe and attuned spaces where people can come and explore and just start to ask some questions, and not leave with a label or a diagnosis, and not leave as a person who, failed at treatment. But we just had spaces where people could explore that. And that interests me much more than, the treatment as treatment is usually done, which is really different than that.
Well, and it's fascinating too, because what you're talking about is shifting the paradigm, and it's not that people don't push up against it, but you're talking about an entire shift, which, might be valuable to talk a little bit about Recovery Café Network and what you guys do. I just pulled a little snippet off the website, and it said that Recovery Café Network is comprised of member organizations committed to serving people suffering from homelessness, addiction, and other mental health challenges. Using the Recovery Café model, every member of the Recovery Café Network is dedicated to these core commitments. And then it lists a bunch of core commitments, which it's really about changing the way we look, just like you've talked about, changing the way we look at someone that's different than us, that may be engaging in behaviors that we consider unhealthy or unsafe, and trying to figure out how do we help them at the same time that we're, serving ourselves. That's a tough thing to change, that kind of a paradigm, but it sounds like that's a lot of what Recovery Café Network does. Can you talk some of that?
Sure. So the cafe model in a lot of ways is, part of what I hope just becomes a very staple addition to every community globally. Nation. Let's start with the nation, because it is that space. It's it's meant to invite people in, give them a meal, give them connection, give them access to friendships and relationships that, they can be deeply, what we talk about at the cafe is deeply known and deeply loved. And so there is no requirement that you identify a certain way, that there is no agenda for your treatment or your recovery journey. There's people who come into cafes across the U.S. who, they come for the meals, they come for the classes, they come because their friends go there, they come because people are nice to them, they come for conversation, but they're not there to get resources. They're not there to I want to get housing, or I want to get into treatment, or I want, to stay free from substances. And I love how much respect and dignity there is in that, and saying, you are deserving of my attention, my love, my support, the food that I make, the building that we pay for. You are deserving of all these things because you exist. That's it. And so you deserve that. And there is no bait and switch. There's no well, now that you're here, let us talk to you about this thing. Well, now that you're here, let us, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? All of that is member driven. So people accessing services at the cafe, which are classes and workshops and, yoga and sewing and art and, whatever they want, there is no agenda for them or trade-off. You don't have to do X to get Y. And so we're just learning how to, as an organization, like, what can we remove as a barrier to people just being deeply known and deeply loved, which I think is the most transformational thing that happens to any of us. And how do we preserve all that dignity and respect and not expect something in return, which is really the spirit of service. That's the spirit of love and service, is there is no expectation.
That's heavy stuff. That is heavy stuff, but it rings true to me, because I've often thought this too, and I've heard you articulate it so well, is that I've wondered what changes, or what options are available when somebody feels truly seen and truly loved. What opens up to them? And if you're in an environment where people do not want to be told what to do, they want to have their free space and they're going to do it how they want, and they're coming to you and they're getting something from that, and you're giving them the ability to be known and to be loved and accepted exactly the way they are. What do you see happening in the lives of these people?
Oh gosh, our cafes are just full of stories, that run the gamut. I mean, there's what you would think of as like typical success story, that people love to hear because based on their own, morality scale or success scale, people are doing the right things. But then there's all these other little tiny moments. There's these tiny moments happening in our cafes across every day that are just, it's those little tiny things that make life so joyful and so worth living. And when I think about my own life and what gets me so excited, it's not these big, huge things that make me come alive. It's these little moments of connection and joy and happiness. And, it sounds so, I don't know what it sounds like, but sometimes I hear myself talk and I'm like, wow, that all sounds really hokey. But it's true. It's true. That's what we're all after is, that moment of like, oh, I can take a deep breath. I'm really relaxed. I'm laughing, like really laughing. My stomach is full. I'm not hungry. I mean, imagine that. Imagine like, we forget what the trauma of homelessness feels like, and people who experience that for whatever reason. Imagine, just imagine. And a lot of us don't have to. A lot of us, even in 12-step or in treatment centers or, these fancy places. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn, like I look at, there's some pretty posh treatment out there. But there's a lot of other stuff happening. There's a whole other world. And, bringing a cafe to your city can really transform the landscape for people. It can really transform what's possible by just creating that space.
Well, and Rebecca, the way you talk about it, it's transformational to the people that are there to know and to deeply love those. That's transformational too. And I think this is, I absolutely believe, and somebody might disagree with me, but I absolutely believe that this is a human experience, and it doesn't have any boundaries, right? There's no entitlement in this experience. That to be known and to be loved, it affects every one of us in deep ways and changes our lives. And I can think of countless, places where that made all the difference to me in an entitled life, right? And if I call it that, a privileged life, an entitled life, that experience of being known and loved deeply changed me too, right? And so that's huge. Let's take the last, little bit of time that we have. I think I'm really curious about two things. Two questions that I have that I'm really curious about is, one, how does the Recovery Cafe get funded? Who pays for that? Because obviously a good share of the people coming in don't have any resources, financially. And two, what does somebody have to do to get maybe connected with you or connected with the Recovery Cafe if they really want to make that part of their community? Because I do think it's powerful.
Yeah, so the cafes are funded through grants, fundraising. You know, every cafe that operates as its own entity, and so they're doing their own fundraising, their own grant writing, things like that. And then there's things that the network provides, like training and onboarding and stuff, like just, you know, some infrastructure support at the front end. But every cafe is the goal is to become, you know, fully financially sustainable through grants and fundraising, and members pay for nothing. You know, obviously there's some paid staff, but a lot of classes and workshops and even open time at the cafe is run by volunteers. And then you've just got people who work their butts off. You know, it's blood, sweat, and tears into these cafes to make them places that people want to be in. And it's a really, really awesome network. And it doesn't take much, actually, to start a cafe. It takes a team of people applying and kind of getting some ducks in a row. And then you join a learning cohort. And so a couple times a year, we pool groups together and kind of do a launch. And then, like we just did one in April, we'll do another one in October. And there's a way to apply on the Recovery Cafe Network website. You're also, you know, you can find us all on LinkedIn. Sarah Burgess is the director. So reaching out to her, I mean, really, we, all of us respond. So you want a cafe? Let's bring you a cafe. We'll make it happen.
What's incredible in the vision that the Recovery Cafe and that you have shared, I think, is transformational for people, whether they want to stay where they're at, but they can be seen, they can be known, and they can be deeply loved. And I can't think of anything more powerful to allow somebody to let go of what they've been holding on to so tightly and look at the possibilities, right? If anything can change somebody, I think those pieces are the most powerful in anybody's life. So incredible. I'm very fascinated by the work you do. And I appreciate you coming on and being willing to share. Is there any last thoughts that you have that you'd love to share?
I don't know. I guess if there was anything left to say, it would just be like an invitation for people who are already doing this work to kind of double down and look a little deeper inside themselves. And then a reminder that the solution is actually not that elusive, that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out why people don't get better. And I think we already know. We already know. It just requires each of us to do so much work internally to be able to show up in a way that where we can have safe space to be connected and to explore. You know, a lot of us, it's really hard to do that. It's really fun to be a person in recovery, working in recovery, getting paid to be an ambassador of recovery, making great money. And, you know, I've held those roles. I've done marketing, I've done outreach, I've done, you know, for-profit, nonprofit, you know, in network, out of network, eating disorders, mental health, substance, I've done it all. And it's fun, but the real work is when we can kind of stay a little bit more grounded about what is actually healing and transformational. And we've known that answer for a long, long time. You just can't monetize it as easily. You can't, you know, create a curriculum. It's just the real work of being human. So I'm constantly working on just trying to heal my relationship with myself enough to show up as a person that I'm really proud of. And I would just invite everyone else to keep doing the same.
I love that, Rebecca. Thank you for what you've brought to this episode and been willing to share of your story and your passion and the change that you're looking for in the future for our communities and for those people who need what you're talking about the very most, right? The ones who are the least seen, the least unknown, and the least loved, and bringing a space where they can have that, which is such a human, it's a necessity. So I love that. Thank you.
Thank you.